Welcome, everybody. Let's get started. I've got a few housekeeping things I want to cover before we actually get started. So thank you for attending today. This is a presentation you will not regret attending. I am ACP National Board Secretary and Professional Development Chair, Dr. Robbie LaRocca. We're also joined today by my co-host, Fred Rogers, and Cara Azar, our ACP Executive Director, who is also the behind-the-scenes producer, and she's the one who makes sure this all goes smoothly. Thank you all. Uh, we're all happy to welcome you to the ACP National Webinar Series and today's presentation, Planning for a Mass Attack in the Workplace, Lessons Learned from Those Who Survived. Our presenter today is Suzanne Bernier, CBCP and Business Resilience Specialist in the Office of Business Resilience for the Legislative Assembly of Ontario. As always, we'll be hosting a Q&A, so please hold your questions until the end for Suzanne and submit those into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Fred will be tracking them. No need to ask this one. Yes, Suzanne will be everybody asks this even though we say. Suzanne will share her slides, so no worrying about that, and we'll send out the link to the recording and the follow-up email to everybody who's registered. So a little bit about today's presenter. Suzanne is a multi-certified, award-winning crisis consultant, speaker, and author who has helped organizations across the globe plan for, respond to, and recover from disasters for nearly 30 years. She was the first female ever to be appointed to the role of Emergency Management Field Officer in Canada and was named 2016's Continuity and Resilience Consultant of the Year, North America, by the Business Continuity Institute, the BCI. She also had the honor of being a guest speaker at the White House later that same year. I'm going to skip over a little bit of this, but I think it's important to mention that her 2015 book, Disaster Heroes, which is a good one, by the way, you should get it and read it, tells the stories of ordinary men, women, and children who have done extraordinary things to help respond, recover, and rebuild following some of the world's most significant disasters. She's currently working on several new projects, including a Disaster Heroes podcast, documentary series, and the second edition of her book, Disaster Heroes 2, TOO, the second edition. That's the official version of her bio, but I also wanted to share that all you needed to know about her can be found in a quote that's part of her email signature block, a Malay proverb that states that just because the river is quiet doesn't mean the crocodiles have left. Very wise. So we're very much looking forward to this presentation. As for today's presentation, Suzanne's dedication and substantial experience provide the foundation for what she'll be sharing with us. In addition to her professional roles, Suzanne also volunteers with an international team that works with disaster and active shooter survivors and families, helping them heal through art therapy. She's met with survivors of families from across the globe after mass attacks, such as those at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, the Las Vegas outdoor concert, the Parkland High School shooting, and the Manchester Arena bombing, and sadly, many more. Suzanne has met with and interviewed several survivors and bereaved families who wanted to share their personal stories and experiences in order to provide recommendations on how companies and communities can better plan for, manage, and recover from these types of attacks in the future. In this presentation, Suzanne will review the findings, observations, and recommendations based on the San Bernardino and other mass attacks survivors' perspectives, which were published in a white paper co-authored by her and renowned UK-based trauma psychotherapist and author Power to Recover, Dr. Liz Royal. While we may not be able to prevent or predict every active shooter, workplace violence, or terror incident in the future, we can help ensure communities and organizations can better plan for, respond to, and recover from such tragedies if and when they do occur. Now, on a side note, I happened to ask Suzanne to tell us something fun that we wouldn't know about her, and she shared that she was on a TV game show as a contestant, match game, years and years ago. How many years we don't know. However, she won. So she's definitely a unique and special person. Suzanne, thank you again so much for being here today, and everybody enjoy.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Robbie. Thanks to everybody for having me today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly try to share my screen make sure everybody is able to see it. And can everybody see the first slide?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, perfect. All right. Well, thanks everybody. And thanks for that great introduction and tidbit, Robbie and gang. So I'm here to talk about terror in the workplace, not so much from the perspective of responders, which we hear a lot about in presentations in different conferences. We don't often hear about or from the survivors and the lessons learned from their perspective. And I've had the honor of meeting with several mass survivors as well as bereaved families who've lost family members in these mass attacks. And I wanted to share with you all of the things that they wanted to share with you through myself as being their advocate for mass survivors and their families. So, just a little bit more about me. Long before 9/11, before Katrina, and before COVID, I was, as Robbie mentioned, the first female field officer in Ontario and in Canada, I believe. And this was taken shortly after I started in 1997. As you can see, there's just me there with a bunch of my male mentors, who were amazing. And it was great to be able to launch the next generation of female as well as male officers that we now see a really good, healthy mix of both. We already went through me, so let's not go through this. Just a little bit more, though, on my background, and I wanted you to know why I do know some of these things and brought me to the Survivor Network. One, I used to conduct a lot of active shooter exercises and training for crisis management teams of mostly government agencies, as well as companies and post-secondary institutions. All of those areas we've seen affected by mass attacks in the past. I also helped communities emotionally recover through an art therapy program that I was volunteering at, which was mentioned during my intro as well. And it led me to being able to work with and talk to and share with survivors from everywhere from the San Bernardino attack, which was one of the first largest ones that we know of back in 2015, but there have been hundreds more since then, unfortunately. Of course, everybody probably still remembers the Orlando Pulse nightclub attack, as well as the Manchester bombing at the Ariana Grande concert, the London bombings, Brussels. We might have forgotten about what happened there. Baton Rouge as well, mass attack on police officers in Baton Rouge. Las Vegas, of course, the concert that was held there with thousands of people who were there and trapped and then had to go back home to wherever they were from. And then the school shooting in Parkland, Florida, and more. So I've been to all of those communities and had the opportunity to visit with and work with in a volunteer capacity with survivors from all of those areas. So I'm going to share the findings from my discussions and meetings with all of these survivors. First of all, let's talk a bit more about when we talk about active shooter, because it's not just about active shooter these days, and we know that, but here's the official definition of an active shooter. And I think everybody pretty much on the line is aware about what an active shooter definition is. Unfortunately, we're seeing more and more of them almost every day, at least on a weekly basis. Yet it seems that many workplaces still aren't prepared for an active intruder attack. Why is that? And I do think it's still that old adage that people say, whatever it is, it won't happen, especially if it's a major incident. Nobody wants to admit that or think that that could happen within their workplace. So they try to just, make sure that it won't happen. If it does happen, it won't happen here. If it does happen here, it won't happen to us. If it does happen to us, it won't be that bad. If it is that bad, there's nothing that can be done. So those are the types of thoughts that sometimes we have or that senior leadership might have, and we need to get them away from thinking that way and how to show them what really does happen and how and why we need to prepare. Active shooter attacks, of course, we do know they happen here and everywhere. So I'm talking about wherever you are today, wherever you're sitting, there could be a potential of an active shooter attack in your community if there hasn't already been. We've seen so many attacks since 2015 onwards. I'll talk to you about that first 2015 event, some of the findings out of that from the survivors that survived that attack. And also just a note that between 2020 and 2024, The FBI documented 223 active shooter incidents across 43 states and DC, representing a 70% increase compared to 2015 to 2019, a 70% increase since I've been volunteering and working with active shooter survivors. And the relationship active shooters have to their victims, as you can see, they're multifaceted, but the most are professionals. And that's because a lot of things happen in the workplace, and workplace members are then, of course, affected. So just a little pie chart to show you that. And now we're going to talk a little bit more about, it's not just about active shooters anymore. You can see all of the different types of weapons. All of these have been used at one time or another in a community, or in an organization or an office building as an attack weapon. And you'll see at the bottom, of course, a vehicle, and we're seeing more and more of those vehicle attacks as well. Here's a little bit more about the domestic terror attack weapons that are used, again, specifically for domestic terror activities, which we're seeing regularly. First, of course, number one, firearms. And of course, that's no surprise. But then we also see bombings, explosives, and incendiaries. Everybody remembers back to the Boston bombings. We'll talk a little bit about that later as well. Then we've got chemical or biological, melees, and then vehicle attacks. So I'm going to see, and I project that we'll see a lot more vehicle attacks as they become more and more popular. And for people who can't have access to firearms or can't get access to firearms, this is another way of people using vehicles to be able to target mass gatherings at the same time. So let's talk a little bit more about mass gatherings and what happened in New Year's Eve 2 years ago. And some of you, I'm sure, do remember New Year's Eve in New Orleans, Louisiana, right where all of the fun activities are on Canal Street and Bourbon. There was a vehicle attack. We just talked about vehicles being used. There was a deathly vehicle attack that happened there. You might have forgot about it because there are so many other attacks that keep happening afterwards that overshadow all those other attacks that have already happened. But this one was a big one. 14 people were killed in that vehicle attack. The suspect was also killed, but 14 people killed in that attack. And I have a couple of recommendations based on what I perceived from the response, and specifically the first press conference that was held after that mass attack, and some do's and don'ts of what to do and what not to do. And some of you might remember the first press conference that was held after that New Year's Eve attack in New Orleans. A lot of different people spoke. Unfortunately, too many people were allowed to take the mic, and it took away from the main message of the survivors as well as the victims and their families. Well, a couple of things, some do's and don'ts at a press conference. If your company or your community ever experiences a mass attack, ensure that your key spokespersons have adequate communications training in advance. It was clear that the police chief in New Orleans, as well as a couple of other speakers, did not have adequate training and were not sat down ahead of time on messaging and to become aware of what kinds of messages or questions they would have to respond to. Number two, don't let the politicians at any level speak or take away the focus from the victims and the survivors following a mass attack crisis. And that is exactly what unfortunately happened during this initial press conference in New Orleans. It ended up being everybody wanting to say their piece, and then all of the politics coming into play, and it really took away from the message and what we needed to keep working on, which was working with the victims' families and the survivors. And then number three, don't let your key spokespeople speak before they've undergone training or they feel comfortable in responding to uncomfortable questions. And that was exactly what happened and was the downfall to the police chief after this press conference, because you could clearly tell she was not comfortable in the uncomfortable questions she had to answer. And also, it appeared was not prepared or briefed enough in advance to be able to practice that messaging. All right, and know that in the age of AI now, we're going to get more and more disinformation, rumors, fake news. It's going to happen, but We just have to roll with it. Let's just make sure that anytime we have any kind of preparatory incident, any kind of exercise that you have, make sure that you put in some injects about some kind of crazy fake news that's going to be delivered through social media. Make that at least one of your injects, because that happens now every time there's an incident. You're going to see something crazy, some rumor that is untrue, and a bunch of misinformation that people like to spread, unfortunately. But the quicker that we can be ready to respond to those misfacts and disinformation, the better that we'll be. So I just want to talk a bit more about the different groups that I was able to meet with and some findings that I took away from them. So some of you might remember the Parkland, Florida school shooting. I was there to provide the art therapy and meet with some of the survivors afterwards. One of the big things that I remember, and some of you might remember, was this was the first school that implemented clear backpacks for all students only. So there was no other backpacks that were allowed. And so you might remember that as an issue. This ended up being the first school that implemented that policy pretty much immediately after that shooting occurred. Las Vegas, Nevada, a lot of us remember. Some of you might be, a lot of us know somebody who knows somebody who was at that Route 91 Harvest Festival just across the street, basically, from Mandalay Bay in October 2017. And of course, you all remember the shooting that happened through the shooter accessing a window through Mandalay Bay and shooting to numerous people within there. But let's talk a little bit deeper about that incident for a second. And I wanted to show you, we're going to talk also about how survivors from all these different mass attacks end up coming together and grieving together and then healing together in the end. And I've seen it so many times everywhere I've been to these mass attacks. You see other people from other mass attacks, survivors, coming in to help and bring messaging and healing to the new community that's been attacked. So this is Reverend Bill Minson from New York City, who was involved in the 9/11 terror attacks and lost many people. And tried to heal many people as well. You'll notice the metal cross that Reverend Bill is wearing. That's actually metal that was taken from the ground at Ground Zero after 9/11, and he wears that every day. But he also brings messages of hope and healing on behalf of those who were impacted almost 25 years ago, and brings hope and healing to other areas. So this is him bringing hope and healing to Las Vegas on behalf of that 9/11 community in all of New York City. Some more insights about specifically this shooting at this concert. So here we had concert goers come from all parts of the US. Where do they go for help? How do they find out? There's no official network. Everybody just went their separate ways after the concert ended, as it did, and weren't able to be connected with afterwards to find out what they needed or how they were feeling. Another thing that happened was people were being accused, or the wrong people were being accused, or playing the blame game right after. Many blamed the hotel housekeeping and security staff at Mandalay Bay for not cluing in beforehand. And there were people that were threatening the security staff and hotel housekeeping people's lives because of rumors being spread about that. How is this a workplace event? Well, think about the hotel that was affected, Mandalay Bay, and all the staff. And I met with the head of security who talked about the trauma that the workers were going through because of them being accused of being a part of this. The city of Las Vegas, as an employer, as a tourism getaway for the world, city of Las Vegas, they had to figure out what kind of messaging they were going to provide and what kind of assistance they were going to provide long term for their community members that were staying in Las Vegas, but also how they were going to reach out to the other communities that were affected. Many attendees, like I said, were from out of state. They bring back their unhealed trauma back to their home communities and workplaces, but they don't have somewhere that's reaching out to them to remind them about their mental health and to be aware of things and where to go for help. They end up being fragmented groups here and there throughout the US and the world. And it's really difficult to be able to measure and be able to reach out to those groups once they've left that concert area and the state of Nevada. Mental health services, it's difficult to know which concert goers went where afterwards in order to monitor and provide links to them to psychological services, which is a very difficult challenge after this type of event. And we'll talk about that again in a bit. So we're going to talk a bit about Pulse Orlando. Of course, a lot of you might remember this nightclub shooting where 44 people lost their lives. In this particular mass shooting, it was different than most, which only lasts several minutes at most. This one lasted several hours. More than 3 hours, people were trapped in that nightclub while the shooter was roaming around and randomly shooting people for that amount of time. But I'll share with you something from one of the survivors. So this is one of the survivors. This is Josh Garcia, and he was at the time the manager of Pulse Nightclub Orlando. And I wanted to ask him. We've become friends now since I've been able to work with him as on a volunteer capacity. And one of the things that he wanted me to mention to people in my field is don't look at social media platforms as being cumbersome. Let's make sure that they can help us. And he said that by him being able to have access to social media and to certain social media platforms and being on the site, he was able to relay to potential other people that were coming towards the site to stay away. And he said that potentially may have saved some people's lives by getting that message before they went to the club and potentially entered the club and had a worse experience. So we'll talk a little bit more about Josh Garcia and what he's doing now in a few slides from now. Now, San Bernardino, California, it was mentioned that this was the first active shooter incident that I, as a volunteer, went to work with the survivors a couple of months afterwards. But just a reminder for those who don't remember, and most people don't remember, just because there have been so many active shooter incidents since then. But this was at the time noted as the second largest mass attack on US soil after 9/11. And it was 14 people were killed in one room during a staff meeting and Christmas holiday session off site. And so I'm going to talk to you about some of the learnings and what some of the survivors that I've gone back and met with several times over the years and what they want people to know from what they survived. So what's the impact 10 plus years later? Because this happened in 2015, as I mentioned. Well, there was a loss of valued critical employees. These were all public health inspectors who were having their Christmas day and luncheon. And it was unfortunately one of their staff members, their colleagues, who left for lunch and came back with his wife and indiscriminately started shooting in that one conference room that they were being trained in. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. There was a lack of trust in the organization because it appeared that San Bernardino County Public Health, their employer, didn't have a clue on what to do. They didn't have a plan. But you know what? Back in 2015, most communities didn't have a plan. Unfortunately, they happened to be one of the worst tragedies before we started looking at and documenting lessons learned and looking at how we could strengthen communities to be able to avoid these kinds of things from happening. Reputational damage. You're going to see a lot more coming out, even though this was 10 years ago. There's a lot of reputational damage that happened immediately afterwards, where a lot of the survivors told the media, friends, members of the public, that they didn't feel that their employer cared for them or did anything to be able to help them after they had just gone through the most horrific thing that they could go through in their lives and witnessed some of their colleagues die in front of them. There's litigation that's going to be happening. I'm going to tell you about what that's about in a second slide. And we always think about either those who survived or those who died. Well, there's also, in these types of attacks, unfortunately, some that are critically injured and will never be able to work again, never be able to walk again. We'll be seeing these types of injuries in any mass attack as well. And sometimes we forget about those who are critically injured and will need support for the rest of their lives. The other thing that I need to mention, because it keeps coming up in every mass attack I've been to so far, is months afterwards, you will start hearing about secondary deaths, about secondary deaths by suicide for those who just are not able to handle what they went through. And that will continue to happen until we can provide the right resources to every community and every group that encounters this kind of a mass attack. What went wrong? Well, was there a plan? I don't think there was. It didn't seem like there was at the time, but a lot of places wouldn't have had one in 2015. What went wrong again? Political interference. A lot of politicians wanted to go and fly into the site and wanted to be able to have a good, photo op there, but didn't actually meet with the survivors. But then weren't in the media telling them that they were meeting with the survivors. And yet the survivors were telling me that that was not true. None of the politicians actually asked to meet with the survivors. They were just there, flew in, did their photo op, and then flew out. So that's what I heard from the survivors that were there. Uneducated leadership. It looks like the leaders did not know how to manage this kind of a crisis, this kind of a large situation at all. There was a narrow focus on those who were affected, basically those who died versus those who remained alive, not thinking about the in between and how much healing will take place depending on who was hurt and injured and how badly they were. And there was apparent lack of crisis management or a proactive response. Fortunately, of course, those services went in. Police and fire were there during the response period, but there was no crisis management coming from the top of the public health department. It seemed like, and no guidance or any kind of psychoeducation, letting people know, here's where you need to go if you start feeling bad or start looking for these signs. And again, fragmented groups where they looked at just survivors and those who died and nothing in between. And it seemed like there was inadequate mental health services where you talk to one survivor and they were offered mental health services maybe a week or two later. And then some several months later, 12, 16 months after the attack, still had not been contacted to be able to talk about what mental health services they needed. That's far too late for them to be contacted for that kind of thing. Some more San Bernardino lessons learned, because there were so many. Unlike most active intruder attacks, this was considered an active shooter, a workplace violence, and a terrorism incident all rolled into one. I mentioned before about litigation. You're going to hear more about that. There was a widow that says her husband advised HR of the concerns about this colleague who was the perpetrator several years later, apparently was advised numerous times, and apparently nothing was done. And so you'll see litigation come out on that soon. The incident was a work holiday party and training session at an off-site location. How many of us rehearse, and look at where the exits are and how we're going to evacuate safely after an active intruder incident at an off-site location that we're just spending the day in? But that wasn't done, and obviously the perpetrator took advantage of that. Question: would your staff know what to do in advance of an active intruder attack like this? The run, hide, fight, we'll get into that as well. Communicating with staff and family and the community throughout the immediate and long-term recovery process is key. And most of the survivors and the survivors' families and the victims' families felt that there was a lack of communications for several days, if not weeks, between the employer and those who survived, as well as the rest of the staff who all worked with these victims who had lost their lives in that room together one day. Now imagine if you're faced with a sudden permanent loss of 14 critical staff, the same team, with the rest of the team not able to return for months, if not years later. So you've got 14 who are gone forever, never coming back, unfortunately. But then you've got the rest of the team who half of them probably aren't coming back anyway due to other permanent injuries or them not feeling safe at the workplace anymore and not feeling like they're being provided for from their employer. Would this kind of thing be covered in your current business continuity or crisis communications plans? Probably not, but that's what happened to this community, and it could happen to the next. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about internal versus external threats, because some people think, oh, we have to work on internal versus external threats in different ways, but you really don't. So, a workplace violence incident can be caused by either a current or former employee, like what happened with the one we just saw, or could happen be a random stranger off the street, and we've seen a lot of examples of that as well over the years. Either way, though, the response and recovery efforts should remain the same, which we're going to talk about in upcoming slides. But the difference is in the planning stages. For an internal threat, make sure, do you have people, plans, programs in place to help staff identify and report concerns or suspicions of a colleague before things escalate? And externally, are there measures your organization could take to prevent outside attackers from accessing your workplace or employees? Okay, I put this up. A lot of people have talked about this. It's a saying that has become quite popular after disasters of this kind of magnitude when people are hurting other people with these mass attacks. So, of course, you've probably heard this saying before: "Hurt people, hurt people." That may very well be. However, I also like to remind people that this is one we don't hear as much as often, but it's much more important, which is healed people heal people. And I'll show you how that's been happening through the survivor networks as well. And we also see survivors helping other survivors now ever since 2015 and onwards, with all of this growing network of survivors of these growing number of mass incidents across the US. You might have heard, and if you haven't, I really want to talk about this group for a second. They have monthly calls, and we just had one a couple of weeks ago, so I was able to meet more members. But it's something called the STOP Coalition, and it's the Stop Coalition Survivors Network. STOP stands for the Survivors of Tragedy Outreach Program. And it's a survivor led coalition dedicated to supporting communities that have been impacted by mass violence. It unites survivor led organizations like Tuesday's Children, some of you might be familiar with as a result of 9/11, the 9/20 Memorial in Colorado, the 9/11 Memorial, of course, in New York, the Boston Bombing Memorial. Now there's a new memorial being arranged for the New Orleans attack site on New Year's Eve. And then some of the supporting art therapy organizations like Stars of Hope USA and the Holding Frames, which ended up being founded by that Orlando Pulse former manager and survivor, Josh Garcia. And now that's how he's being able to give back to other communities that are going through what his community went through several years ago. The goal of STOP is to build a coordinated, trauma led organization to tragedy and violence across the US. They promote survivor led peer advocacy, public education and awareness, and all the great stuff that's listed there. And I just wanted to make sure that those of you who aren't aware of this become aware of this. You might know somebody who has been affected by something, and you might want to just let them know to reach out to Stop Coalition and become one of their members. It's a wonderful program. Survivors leading survivors through trauma into healing. Let's go back now to Orlando and the Pulse nightclub shooting for a second. I wanted to mention about Josh Garcia. He was the manager at the time of the shooting, as well as one of the heroes that kept people at bay and tried to one in and pull some of his staff and friends out. Just a horrible tragedy for him, but he turned it into a learning experience and something to give back to other communities who are going to go through the same thing. So he got involved with Stars of Hope, which was an art therapy program that I was a volunteer with. And then somebody sent him one of these Stars of Hope, which was painted by a community member from San Bernardino. And then he became so involved and was so appreciative of just receiving this star from somebody else who was a survivor from a different mass attack that he just went fully on board and eventually became the head of the Stars of Hope program. And now, like I said, he's now just changed, pivoted from Stars of Hope, and now he has and leads his own foundation. So a survivor helping other survivors, which a lot of the time we just miss or we don't hear about. And this is what I also wanted to show is these are also survivors of the Pulse attack 1 year later, all on site, that Josh organized to have people who lost their family members or who were in the bar that day to come and be able to paint these stars of hope, that they were going to decide which community they wanted them to go to. And it helped those survivors here heal after their losses, and also know that they were giving back to the next community to go forward. So while they painted, we were there for the day, and we ended up painting over 800 of these stars of hope with survivors and victims' family members 1 year after the shooting occurred. And that was what we gave back to the community to be able to try and heal. And the community at the time, the Manchester bombing had just recently occurred. That was the Ariana Grande concert that you might remember hearing about. So they decided, Orlando Pulse nightclub painters decided that they wanted their stars to go to Manchester after that bombing. And so that's what we arranged. And we did do that. You'll see Love Travels Over Oceans. That was meaning that we were going to bring these stars over to where they needed to be in Manchester. This was part of the team. I just want to mention, I'm not going to go through all of them, but all of these people and faces are all either survivors of mass attacks or mass incidents, or family members of those who've lost their lives during mass incidents from 9/11 right onwards up until recently. 2 weeks later, we listened and provided what the Orlando Pulse nightclub painters wanted, and we delivered all of their 800 stars to Greater Manchester 2 weeks later. We also had a meeting with the Greater Manchester Police Department, who wanted to hear a bit more about how we were doing this kind of thing and going from the US to Manchester to provide hope and healing, how they wanted to bring it in within their own police department to figure out how they could implement Stars of Hope during incidents for their team members as well. We had a lovely meeting with them, which was unbelievable for them to be able to actually recognize how much of a positive thing just a painted star could make to a survivor of a deadly mass attack halfway across the world. And then we even got on BBC, which was kind of nice to, again, recognize some of the survivors of these attacks and the messages that they were bringing back. But here's some key survivor insights that I want to get to share with everybody. One of the main things that I noticed, especially after I spoke to most everyone who was in the room that day in San Bernardino, is that, and it's something that I have not heard often from anybody, but your brain will try to convince yourself that it's not real, or that it's just an active shooter drill for the first several seconds. Everybody I talked to during that deathly shooting were all trying to convince themselves in their brain for several seconds, oh, why would they choose now to have an active shooter drill? This is a stupid time to have a drill. Or, wow, this looks so real. How did they make it so realistic looking? So realistically, many times, by the time they're running all of this and trying to deny what's really happening, it's far too late to run or hide. I know the practice is to say run, hide, fight, but I want you to know what really happens inside the minds of these survivors and what they witness and how your brain reacts. Don't wait to hear from survivors on their needs after an attack. And that was one of the biggest complaints from the San Bernardino survivors as well. They were being asked, what do you need? Well, they don't know what they need. They just went through this most horrific attack imaginable. They need people to guide them to where they need, not asking them, because of course they don't know what they need. They've never been involved in something like this before. And to ask them to think about something like that when they've just gone through this horrific loss and attack is just unfair. most don't know what they need, and they're going to need guidance to steer them in the right direction for both the physical and emotional healing that could take the rest of their lives. Like I said, many of the survivors have life-altering injuries and disabilities, preventing them from ever working again, and they'll need support for the rest of their lives. Remember, every mass attack re-traumatizes the survivors from previous impacted communities. Also, consider those secondary deaths by suicide that I mentioned, because they're happening after every single mass attack that we see. Overall, I wanted to share as well that for some reason, male survivors seem to take longer to heal or have a more difficult time healing from mass attacks. And the only thing I could think of is that a lot of men have survivor's guilt. A lot, anybody in the room would have had some of that survivor's guilt, but also a bit of a indirect hero complex, where a lot of men feel like they should have been the savior, they should have been the hero to be able to save those lives, and instead they witnessed 14 people lose their lives in front of them, and they weren't able to do anything about it. And I think that's what makes the male survivors heal a little bit more slowly. And then just a reminder to people how best to prepare for an active intruder incident. Prepare by using the phases of emergency management. Just a reminder on that. The mitigation phase. Did you perform a risk assessment? How easy is it for an intruder to access your building, your office, your employees? Are there measures you can take to make your building more secure? The locks on doors, key cards, turnstiles, all those things. Have security plans reviewed and tested regularly. Also have a crisis communications plan on how you're going to communicate during this kind of attack. Preparedness. All right, on the preparedness side, have a plan. Consider physical security measures. Ensure your facility has at least 2 evacuation routes, a main and an alternate, and everybody's aware of them and knows about them. Clearly post and mark evacuation routes in obvious locations throughout your office or your building. When you're pre-selecting shelter-in-place locations, consider any safe areas within the facility that can provide good cover and concealment options. All right, drills. Do drills. I know a lot of people say that they don't see the value in doing drills, but I can say the opposite. Conduct an annual physical drill, but also have things within that drill, like having people recognize the sound of gunshots. What's the difference between the sound of a car backfiring or the sound of a gunshot that's nearby? And then reacting quickly when gunshots are heard or when a shooting or an active attack is witnessed. And the training should cover the run, hide, fight, even though we may not have time for the first two. Run, hide, fight, calling 911 if you can, and how to react when law enforcement arrives. And then now we get into the response phase under emergency management. It's that whole run or escape, hide, fight if you can, fight only as a last resort. Just a reminder, so many different communities now, as well as universities and different areas, have different run, hide, fight videos that they promote. So I would highly recommend that you choose one of the videos that's already available out there that you like, to be able to start that training with your personnel, with your employees, on having them all sit down and look at run, hide, fight, and then have a talk about it afterwards. First, on run, a little bit more. 1, warn individuals not to enter an area where the active shooter may be. Have an escape route and plan in mind beforehand. Evacuate regardless of whether others agree to follow. Leave your belongings behind. People always try to lug as much as they can. Leave your belongings behind. Your life is what counts. Help others escape if possible. Now, on the hide side, if safe evacuation isn't possible, find a place to hide where the active shooter is less likely to find you. So what should your hiding place be? Should be out of the active shooter's view, should provide protection if shots are fired in your direction, like an office with a closed and locked door, and not trap or restrict your movement any further than it already is. Another thing that the FBI say is one of the best hiding places once you have a locked door in front of you, is to hide at the base of the locked door. at the bottom, because if the shooter tries to straight shoot into the door window or whatever, then they won't hit you because you'll be at the bottom. All right, more hiding safety. Lock the door if you can. Silence cell phones. Even the vibrate setting can give away your location. That's happened before. It happened at the Pulse nightclub shooting, where people were identified being in the bathroom with their cell phones vibrating. Hide behind things. Hide behind large items like cabinets and desks. Duck behind a door. Get close to the ground, as I mentioned, and remain quiet. Fight if you can't run or hide, and only as a last resort, and only when your life is in imminent danger. Attempt to disrupt or incapacitate the active intruder. It's better if it's a mass attack because you have a group that should fight against the aggressor together. Act as aggressively as possible against him or her. Throw items and use improvised weapons and work together to incapacitate the intruder. You'll have a much better shot at doing so. Now let's do a quick little activity. I want you to look around the room or the office you're in right now. And what would you do in an active shooter situation? Would it be better to run or hide or attack? What could you do to protect yourself and those around you if this would happen right now where you are? Just have a think about it for a second and look around. So here's some suggested actions. Locate a safe, viable evacuation route or routes. If you're planning to hide, figure out how to blockade the door. Consider the options on where best to hide. Close, cover, and move away from windows. Silence your cell phones and other electronics. If you're planning to hide, identify that escape route. Like we said, call 911 when it is safe to do so. Some more on the recovery phase. Have recovery plans in place to ensure that you can support the emotional and the physical recovery of your survivors and the victims' families, for their immediate needs as well as the long-term needs that are going to be required for some survivors as well as their families. Recovery is a long-term process when it comes to mass attacks, taking months, if not years, to be able to heal through. A bit more on business continuity and recovery when it comes to mass attacks. Like I mentioned, you've got an immediate and permanent loss of some staff due to fatalities and injuries due to a mass event. It could take other surviving staff weeks, months, or even years to be able to return to work. Think about how you're going to replace that part of your staff as well. And business recovery, is it returning to work? Is it returning to normal? Maybe you need to fix things or certain things, change things, so that this does not happen again. So maybe we don't want to return to normal. Maybe we want to, instead of bouncing back, we want to bounce forward. That's my new saying. I don't want to bounce back from something. Why don't we bounce forward into something better? Some more things to consider before we open it up to questions. Where to shelter staff following an active intruder incident. That was very much lacking with the San Bernardino attack. Their immediate and long-term grief counseling and support for survivors and employees have to be provided almost immediately after the attack happens. Effective media management and crisis communications has to happen constantly throughout the event. And the number of fatalities, we need to deal with not only the fatalities, but those victims' family members as well. There's going to be short and long-term injuries. And we saw that through San Bernardino to the Orlando to all of the other shootings. Some of them are not so able to recover. And as I mentioned, some have lifetime injuries that will prevent them from even working anymore. So there might not be a return to work, but if there is, consider how that return to work happens, and has to be in a phased manner so that psychologically everybody's ready to return to the workplace where something happened, because that's very psychologically affected as well. And then providing support to the victim's family members and remembering to do that as long as necessary. And remember as well that during the 1 year and annual anniversaries of the attacks are going to be triggering events. And survivors are going to keep reliving what they lived originally every time another attack happens, unfortunately. But that's what does happen. Now, one last slide. We can't always stop trauma, but we can change how we manage its impact. My final thoughts: preparedness and training in advance could help save lives in the future. Be sure to support mental health needs throughout both the immediate and long term recovery of anyone impacted by an attack. Don't expect survivors to ask for or know what support or help they may need. You come to them with what they need. Some common assumptions are not based on reality. So learn from real events, other communities, other survivors who've gone through it. They know best what to do and what worked and what didn't work. And any similar attack in the future is going to impact and re traumatize anyone who's gone through it in the past. A great resource that I want to share if anybody's interested: Dr. Liz Royal from the UK partnered with someone on this excellent book on how to deal with psychological trauma at work. I have a couple of copies that I've given out already to people. It's an amazing resource. Otherwise, I will throw it back and answer any questions. And if you want to reach out to me on LinkedIn, you can feel free to do that. And I hope to stay connected with all of you.
I
I'm going to stop sharing now.
a little bit of a loss for words. I've co-hosted several hundred ACP webinars in the last 18 years, and I don't remember many that were as valuable or had as much of an impact as this one. But we do promise to wrap up by the top of the hour. We've got quite a few questions already, Suzanne. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but if there are one or two or four questions we don't get to, would you be willing to respond to those individually later, maybe tomorrow?
Of course, sure.
That would be great. Okay, let's go ahead and get into them. What are the most important lessons you've learned after speaking one-on-one with survivors of mass attacks?
You know what? I think number one, and it was such a surprise to me that I kept hearing it over and over, is what I mentioned about what our brain goes through when we're actually in the moment of that attack, and how many seconds we try to convince ourselves it's not real, it's a drill, that kind of thing, before we come to and realize that it's an actual event. And that's why, unfortunately, I feel that the run, hide, fight sometimes might not be practical depending on the group, the room, and also how people react. Yeah, sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought from there, but that was the most surprising. And the most surprising was it wasn't just coming from one person, it was almost every person that I talked to who was in the room that day that witnessed people being shot and were convincing themselves that this was, wow, how did they get the fake blood to look so realistic? I mean, it was unreal. And I'd never heard that on the news or from any other organization before, that that's what goes on. But it clearly does, because everybody who I spoke to who was in the room that day were trying to talk themselves out of it for several seconds before it became real.
Okay. The next one, I've heard of the ripple effect. Explain how that impacts the community after a deadly mass attack. The ripple.
Right. Yeah, well, so let's say for a community like San Bernardino, you think maybe, oh, it's only the employer that needs to be prepared and deal with it. But really, you'd had, 70 some people who were in that room that day. 14 of them never came back. Several more of them are injured and will never be able to walk again, or will need several more operations to be able uh, to do so. And sorry, can you just repeat the question so that,
How does the ripple effect
yeah.
affect communities?
Right. So as soon as you've got a mass attack, every single person that was in the room that day has been somehow affected. And now they're going to go back to their families. And now they're going to either hopefully be able to seek out, if they're being able to be steered to the right direction, to get resources that they need, to not be able to now impact their family members. Let's say if somebody, can't control their temper, or their personality has changed because they've witnessed something like this, but they're not getting the mental health needs that they need. They then bring this to the family. And then now you've got family members who are being traumatized, who weren't even part of the traumatic experience, who now they need support from the community. And then all the members of the community. You had 70 some people in the room that day. They all had family members and friends who all were part of that community. So they were all affected as well in all different ways. The one good thing and the positive thing I saw from one of the ripple effects from San Bernardino was a local gym owner decided to open up his gym for free and be able to give individual lessons, defense lessons, because that's what some of the survivors said they wanted next, was to be able to get detailed lessons on how to ensure their physical safety and security if they were ever involved in something like this again. So that gym owner opened up his gym for free. And because so many of the traumatized couldn't go into a group setting for training, he actually just held group training sessions for the survivors or the family members, as well as one-on-one individual sessions for those who just couldn't communicate more than just one-on-one. So with the ripple effect, you see a lot more trauma cases affecting all the different services within your community that you're not used to dealing with. And you may have to now use all of these services and need them for months, if not years. Is your community ready for something like that? Or any of our communities ready for something like that if they haven't been in it before?
Okay, we've got about 3.5 minutes left. Let me try to squeeze three in. What do mass attack survivors want practitioners to know when planning for or responding to similar attacks in the future?
One of the biggest things that I got from the survivors was that they don't want to be looked at as victims and that they're survivors. And let's look to them. Sometimes they can help us heal during an emergency or help figure out how we can help that mass attack group heal. I think that a lot of survivors feel that they'll hear in news reports that they'll be referred to as victims. In the meantime, all you're doing, the bottom line is victims of any mass attack are the ones who died. Anybody else is a survivor. And so once you start calling survivors victims, you're kind of re-victimizing them and making them feel like a victim, as opposed to talking about them as a survivor. And sometimes, as we see, these survivors have great ideas that are helping not only their communities heal, but future communities heal as well.
Okay, if you could recommend one thing to help an organization prepare for a potential mass attack, what would it be?
I would say be able to sit down, talk to your senior executives. If you don't already have some kind of training plan in place, have at least some basic plan in place to be able to train active shooter drills, hold a drill. But before that, be able to sit down with people and have that run, hide, fight video that you've selected. Like there's so many out there that you'll be able to pick from, and just take people through, walk people through it, and maybe use an example of a prior incident, because that's the best way people can connect to what's really going on. It's not with all the plans and the findings. It's when we talk about this family or this person or this survivor and how they survive and what they did afterwards. So make sure that we can educate our executive teams on what really happens to survivors during a mass attack.
Okay, last one, and we'll have to go quickly. What was the best and or worst piece of advice you've ever given throughout your career? I'm sorry, you've been given throughout your career.
Okay, I think what it is a long time ago in my emergency management part of my career, one of my mentors at the time, male mentors at the time, he was the chief coroner actually of the province of Ontario at the time, and he was a mentor of mine. And what he said to me, because I was going from his office to another office for another job, and he leaned over to me and he said, you know, it's not a good thing you jumping around to all these different things and doing all these different things. You should stick to one place. Nobody's ever going to have respect for you. They're just going to think you're a jumper. And so I said, well, thank you for that. And I didn't follow it. And and I'm so glad I didn't follow it,
Good.
because I definitely wouldn't have made it to the White House if I would have stayed working for the Ontario government. So,
Well, good for
yeah.
you and good for us, and we're thankful for your experience. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. And again, somebody in my position is not supposed to be speechless, but this has been just tremendous. Um, So, Suzanne, thank you so much. As always, ACP is coordinating several future webinars, so keep an eye out for your news and views emails for those announcements, but also make it a habit. As always, go to the ACP website and click on upcoming events. It's right there. The button's right there on the top right of the landing page. Our next scheduled presentation will be on September 22nd, when Fusion Risk Management will present the following, which is AI for BC Teams. 3 tasks to automate this quarter and 2 to never hand over. You can register for that right now as opposed to waiting for the email. You can register for that right now. Go to the ACP website, hit upcoming events, and advance the calendar through to September. And go to September 22nd, click on that link. Same as always, everything else. And you can register right now. Thanks again for being with us today. Please take 12 seconds to complete the tiny little bitty survey that pops up when you exit. As always, we also really like to hear your suggestions about future webinars. So please let us know if you have any suggestions on behalf of Suzanne, Robbie, and Cara. Enjoy the rest of your August, be resilient, and we will see you at the next ACP webinar on September 22nd. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzanne. This was great.
Thank you all.